Have you ever wondered what the music entertainment industry looks like from the inside and what it takes to succeed in one? If so, stay with us on the Just Be Better podcast as we explore these secrets with our incredible guest, Ross Anderson, an award-winning creative director and executive producer who's worked with brands like Apple, Red Bull, and more. Welcome to our podcast, Ross. I'm very thrilled to have you here. Could you start by briefly introducing yourself to our audience and tell us a bit more about your background?
Hi, well, lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. My name's Ross Anderson, and I am, what do I call myself? I've been an exec producer, a creative director, a company owner, a founder, and a CEO all at once, really. I think my background, I started in music in the early 2000s, and since then been working with content and making content for some of the world's biggest music artists and brands, and working with amazing agencies, content agencies and advertising agencies and everything in between. So yeah, let me know what you want to know.
I think I would love to start at the very beginning of your career. And from overall perception, the entertainment industry is one of the most brutal industries there is, probably, with the competition, the arrogance, the level of work you have to do. How did you end up in music entertainment in general? And more importantly, what's your recipe for success?
Yes, you're right. It has that reputation. I got into it initially because I love music, and I really genuinely had a passion for it. I went to art college, and which is a great way, ironically, of getting into the music business. But a lot of bands and everything else go to art college, and I found that it was a natural progression for me. And I started initially in Manchester working for a guy who was a legend in the sort of 80s and 90s, a guy called Tony Wilson. And he had a label called Factory Records, and bands like the Happy Mondays. I don't know if you've heard of those, but it was part of that sort of big Manchester scene with the Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, that sort of bands. And I fell into it that way, really, and worked for him, and then moved to London and worked for Polydor Records. And yeah, as I say, I love music, and I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to be in the business of it. I realized quite quickly that it is a business, and that it's about selling units and about, like any other business, making money. So I think that, and there was lots of people in it that didn't seem to be there as much for the music. They were there for the business, So it was, it was fast paced, and it was exciting, and in some ways I miss it, but in some ways I don't miss the sort of I suppose, as you say, brutal nature of it. But yeah, I think it was an interesting place to start, definitely.
So your very first role, if I understand correctly, was a producer for music videos. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I started in marketing, and then I was quickly moved into music video, overseeing commissioning. I was a commissioner, so I'd oversee all the music videos for the artists on that record label, and then that spread into some of the other artists on the in the group. People like Enrique Iglesias, or who's was a big global artist, or the Rolling Stones, or who else? Bands like UK bands like Snow Patrol that had gone big in the sort of internationally. I'm trying to think of other names of bands. Really, there was lots, but it was really interesting because I think we were primarily a pop label. We always had a record in the top 10, as I remember. I was there for about 10 years. It almost became normal that we were one of the best selling. We were the best selling record label, and it was sort of it was about how many units you'd sold, and how long we'd stayed at number one. It wasn't just about being number one. So which is funny because when I'd started, it was really about getting a record that would even enter the charts, and then going to this place where it was really about. It's not about entering the charts. It's about being number one for as long as you possibly can and selling as many as you possibly can. So, but it was also, it was very creative time, and it was, looking at different artists' stories and their backgrounds and their narratives, and if it was a really sort of straight off the shelf, very new pop artist, it was about creating a story for that person, from their touch points and from their personality, but sort of creating an aesthetic around them and everything that would brand them like any other brand, So it was, and it was always really last minute, fast paced. So you had to be really creative. You had to, always, the record always, there was never a gap really between when they'd finished making the record and when they wanted to release it, because they wanted to get it out as soon as possible. And I remember actually it was so fast paced that they gave me a driver because I was in London and I couldn't go underground because I was always on the phone. I couldn't lose the
Oh,
signal.
wow.
So I was, because everything was just happening so fast. So yeah, it was. I remember going to places like LA and thinking, what a lovely amount of time it is that I can spend on the plane where phones didn't work. That was my sort of break.
I had this question for later on, but I feel like I need to ask it now. How did your life and work balance existed in such a, did you had any life outside of work?
No, that's a good question. I didn't, and I think that's part of the reason why I left. Actually, was because I had two young children, and there was. I remember that I would have cancelled holidays, or depending on the release time, that there was always a release that was very important. Every new artist was very important, and it did affect that time really in terms of them growing up. So I thought they just got to an age where I was missing too much, and that's when I resigned and said, actually, thank you, it's been amazing. I remember it was my 10th year, and the my boss at the time, the managing director, came up and said, here's a bottle of champagne, and congratulations, you've been here 10 years. And sort of not immediately, but in response, my reaction was, thanks, I'm going to leave. That's a good time to say goodbye.
You mentioned you worked with some of the fantastic musicians and bands, and I'm not gonna lie, I was jamming to Enrique Iglesias before our call after looking through your profile.
Great.
The entertainment industry, again, is known for having some of the most amazing and talented people overall, but some of the most obnoxious ones as well. How did you manage when it came to dealing with different performers, different clients, and actually working with their demands as stakeholders?
Actually, you know what? It wasn't the artists that were usually the biggest problem. It was usually the people that were very close to them, and because of the amount of pressure that they were under, and everybody was under, because of the short timescales and the lots of money at stake, and also their image is at stake, which is what they rely on. So I can understand that pressure. I think that it was really about trying to just take a step back and take a breath whenever that time came. That everybody was really losing it. I think that, and the ability as well, that I was never really that. I was starstruck a couple of times. One with Mick Jagger and one with Sting, actually, weirdly, because both of which my dad was a big fan of. And I sort of when I met them, I was I don't know what happened. It was just that it really got to me. But but usually it was more that they were usually my age, and I was they were my contemporaries. They were people, and I understood their position, and hopefully they understood mine. So I think it was always just about being like any sort of boiling point situation. It's usually just about trying to just be calm and try and be rational and try and be fair. I think that because there's always variables, especially with film production and that world of entertainment. There's always huge variables that can happen. I can tell you lots of different stories about situations that we've been in where it was difficult. But I think it's just about being a human being and not trying to succumb to any of those. I suppose the things that people succumb to, like the power thing, the bullying thing, those things that people do in business. And actually, we talk about entertainment being the worst for that. Actually, I've found that in every you find elements of that in every sort of business situation, I think, since then, outside of entertainment as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, perfectly. I think entertainment industry got the name more from the younger talent that's trying to enter the scene view. I know quite a lot of people in musical theater and different entertainment in London especially. And I had to listen to their rejections and how they're being treated as people who are auditioning for things. And I was like, I'm not sure how that would go in any other industry if someone started bullying you for your weight, your height, your skin color, for whatever reason, and they have no filter whatsoever when it comes to in that industry particularly.
No, they don't. And actually, I think that I didn't see much of that because usually I was in charge of that, which meant that we didn't do it. We don't. That if someone wasn't right for a role in a music video, then we would just say that they weren't right. We wouldn't be trying to make them do something they didn't want to do, or trying to get them to be someone that they weren't going to be. I mean, there is a disillusionment in rejection, and there's obviously an emotional reaction to that. But I think that if you're fair and polite and straightforward about it, then I think being honest, I think, was quite a big thing. The company I set up immediately after when I worked for Universal was called Nice and Polite. And the reason why it was called Nice and Polite is because I wanted the world to be a bit more nice and polite, you know, and I think maybe that was a reaction to the type of people that I'd been working with. But I think it was trying to almost write a short manifesto as to how we were going to behave as a business. And I think that's really important that, you know, my son has got a poster on his wall which says it's cool to be kind. And I think it is cool to be kind. You know, I think it's, especially in that business, because it was all based on being, what was the next cool thing? What was the next big thing? Who's the next big director, or what's the next coolest track? And with that comes a lot of, probably a lot of negativity. But I think that, you know, actually it didn't cost us anything to be good people, you know, or at least be as straightforward as we could be when we could be. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of times when I might have been criticized for not doing that, but we tried our hardest to, as much as we could.
I think as long as you don't have a bad intent in you, it's going to be accepted much more differently than if you're actually trying to insult someone.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I think sometimes that power, that whatever power it is, whether it's you know, whatever sort of situation you're in, I think that, yeah, some people react differently to others. You know, some people enjoy it a bit more than others.
And moving on to your personal ventures, then you founded and managed successful agency from startup to IPO. Firstly, when was that decision, that light bulb moment in your head that was like, I'm going to go into my own venture and entrepreneurship and start my own agency? Was it with a bottle of champagne when your previous manager came?
Well, it happened. My dad, you know, I'll go back to my dad again, but my dad worked for Procter & Gamble for 30 years. And he went and he was head of sales globally, and he did a really good job of it. And then he went on a plane and it made him go deaf. And very quickly he wasn't useful anymore. And I remember how much that hurt his feelings, that, you know, for whatever reason, I'm sure there was lots to it, but I think that I just remember him being hurt by it. And I thought, I don't really want to work for a company on that scale that doesn't value me for the whole of my life, and then be upset by the fact that because I wasn't, you know, useful anymore, that then they can cast me aside. So, and her, you know, and that sort of emotional response. So I remember thinking that, you know, I need to do something for me. I need to do something that I could achieve, you know, on my own, really, without. And I didn't feel that when I was working up my way up the sort of ladder in a corporate company. So at the time, and I think there's lots of reasons why that's, you know, you can probably get the same fulfillment from doing that. I wouldn't say you couldn't, but I think for me, it felt like I need to go and try and achieve something. I need to go and make something. I think I was always really had that artistic temperament. I've got to go and make something. I've got to build something and then see where it goes, you know.
And looking from the startup perspective, majority of I think it's 0.006% overall of startups that actually go from being a startup to IPO or succession or a successful sell. How did you manage to get your business from startup to IPO in only 5 years? What was your secret, you think?
Well, I think the quick answer is not on my own. You know, the idea of selling the company was something that was always in my mind. I wasn't going to be the owner of a creative agency, production house until, you know, for the rest of time. It was always that I really wanted to, you know, do it for a certain amount of time, get out of it what I needed to get out of it, realize that it had a ceiling, and then exit. But it's really difficult to sell a company that isn't, you know, above 20 million quid. I mean, it's, you know, it's really hard to do that. And I think usually they're, like mine was, a company that was run by one person who's got the client base or has built the client base. It's a one-man band, and they you know, it's probably like a lifestyle business, and they you know, what's the opportunity for growth, really, you know. So I think that what happened and what was really interesting was this idea of agglomeration that came along, this idea of joining together with other businesses that were equally, you know, of an equal sort of size, that under 20 million. I think we got beyond that, actually, but in terms of the other businesses that came along, because it got bigger very quickly. But initially it was just 4 companies that were all, but 3 of which were based in Singapore. We were based in London, and put those together, and then you've got something which equals much more than 20 million. and you've got, as a sort of scale, and that then you can take to IPO. So and there was a chap called Jeremy Harbour that I met, who was a really sort of inspirational businessman who just really talked to the sort of values that I really held dear, the idea of better business, the idea of sort of being able to give business owners that exit that they might need was the sell, in terms of being able to get to a point where you don't just have to constantly think about the light bulb going on, the sort of keeping the lights on. It was really just about sort of trying to build something and really benefit from it. Also, I really like the idea of that sort of international team culture. There's only a certain level to what you can do on your own. And so, but without the corporate structure that I'd been in, if that makes sense. So you sort of, you're on your own terms, but you can join together in a peer-to-peer way, which means that you can benefit. It felt like it ticked a lot of boxes for me. And that's why it got there. And it happened very quickly. I think they were, I came into their sort of concept just at the point when they were looking for different businesses that might complement it. It became a thing called a marketing group. And we took it to IPO on the NASDAQ exchange in Sweden in 2016. Yeah.
Well done, you. Like, from zero to IPO in 5 years, that's more than 90% of companies can say.
Well, yeah, it was an exciting time. It was a real learning curve. I'd only just learned really how to run a business, never mind take it to IPO. And luckily, there was lots of people there that were extremely had a real passion for doing that, a real sort of energy for doing that, but also a knowledge base of, they'd gone through that process, at least in, at least as a concept, properly and understood it. So I was there to learn, and I was also there to talk to other businesses about, again, going back to this idea of this sort of maybe slightly utopian model of doing business, which was, working with people who you understand what they do. They completely understand their own market, their own client base, and the way that they do things. You're not acquiring people to take that over and push them out. You're acquiring them to work with them. And I think that sort of that mutually beneficial group, which was the idea, was really attractive. And I think it was attractive. My job was to then explain that, or try and make other business owners that were in my situation prior to joining the same thing, which was that it was the idea was a really positive one.
No, that sounds like a very compelling idea, even from looking from a side. If you have a few different businesses in different locations and you can join and actually make a big profit, then why not? And learn from other cultures and different businesses.
Yeah, definitely. And also, understand that you're not trying to, I think some sort of acquisition groups or things that come together, they start to become one blob, one brand, one mindset, one sort of look and feel and structure. I think that doesn't really work, especially when it's more creative, when the industries are more creative. Each of them needs a personality. I remember seeing that with Universal. Actually, it started, and there was Island Records, and there was Polydor Records, and there was these amazing brands that had been built, by the personality of the artists that were within them, and the music that they were making was Island was so beautiful what they put together. I think over time, and Island actually have just amalgamated, I think, with EMI, that over time that gets lost, that personality gets lost. And I think that's the shame, because I think people are drawn to, their interest is drawn to that personality and that sort of brand being unique. I don't think anybody's been drawn to a brand that's bland and one size fits all. Where's the interest in that?
No, I couldn't agree more with you, especially from my side. Like, I work with quite a lot of different startups across different countries. And one of the mistakes that I see quite often in companies, they take the blueprint of Google, Netflix, and basically copy paste it at the beginning,
right,
rather than trying to add at least elements of their own soul and explain what it means. And Because I've seen over and over again where companies come in and it's like, yes, we want the exact same staff handbook as Netflix done. It's like, that's not really your staff handbook then.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what works for someone else can't necessarily work for you. I think there's sort of, and I mean, there's lots to be learned. There's lots to be learned from those businesses and the way that those structures are built and the way and the lessons they've learned. But I think that at the center of it has to be a unique offering, a unique selling point, and that's what you'll be able to use in your marketing and your sales pitch and everything, and your HR conversations. They all have to be rooted in that central personality, I think.
And that's what I think will separate future companies from AI built companies as well.
I think so.
That uniqueness.
Yeah, and isn't it one of the brilliant things about being human is that you can sense something that hasn't got that unique, that uniqueness. You can sense it, you can feel it. You can tell when someone on Instagram is a bot, you just know, and I think there's sort of that idea of, that personality getting, not dying. I'm sort of been thinking a lot about AI myself, actually, in terms of creativity and how it's affecting creativity. But the central idea, it's the one thing that keeps things interesting. It's the one thing that keeps people coming back. It's the one thing that is exciting. And I think those, I'm not sure it'd be interesting to see whether AI can recreate that.
I honestly doubt it will. I use AI quite a lot for checking my grammar and everything.
Yeah.
And even when you give a very clear indication, I just need to make sure that I have the dots in the right places. They add words that I honestly think I used when I was 6 after Googling Therosaurus or something, where there's like 10 words and no one knows the meaning, but it sounds very impressive. And AIs keep taking all of the Harvard dictionaries and everything, words that never been used in like last 100 years sometimes. So I see that a lot on LinkedIn nowadays.
Yeah, I think it definitely speeds things up, doesn't it, in terms of being able to, research information and collate things. And as you say, grammar, I think we'll get worse at spelling, or I will. But because you won't need to. But I think, but when it comes to actually the sort of essence of creativity, I think it's always going to be borrowed. And that means that it's always going to be second rate.
But moving on to actually moving back to the topic, you worked with so many different brands and so many amazing people. Could you share some memorable experiences or projects that stand out to you even nowadays?
I suppose I'm quite a big fan of, I suppose I've worked in advertising, and making straight up adverts for products is probably the least interesting thing. I think usually when we're talking primarily about people and what their stories are, that's when I start to become really interested. So I think, we did a film for when it was the sort of Black Lives Matter time, and there was the Black Lives Matter protests, and we did a film with a photographer called Missan Harriman, which was just a series of photos that he'd taken in the Black Lives Matter protests and put together to a friend of mine scored the music. And it was really powerful. It was with some quotes that they'd chosen to sort of encapsulate that time, because I'm sure, as you'll remember, it was a global thing, and it was really when it first happened, it was a very powerful time. It was probably very divisive, but it felt like a moment in history, and I think that for me felt to be involved in that. We made a film that then got put on the screens at Piccadilly Circus, and Vogue UK I think used it on their socials. So it was a sort of alternative thing. It wasn't on TV, but it felt a little bit not activist to do it. It just felt it felt really positive, and I think that line in the work I've been doing since when I was at Nice and Polite, we did a self-funded film about people from the LGBTQ community, because I didn't understand enough about it. So I wanted to try and, ask questions and through our director, Craig, who was brilliant, to understand more about it, because I just felt really naive and really sort of a bit ignorant to the whole situation. So I wanted to try and just do really simple portraits of people and talking about who they are. And actually what the outcome of that was that you realize they're just lots of different, really interesting people. They're not without categories, which is the whole point, I think, So I think those type of projects, I did a film in lockdown, which was about a business owner who'd who was right, had to fire all his staff and was just at the brink of losing everything, and went out on social media and asked for help. A guy in the middle of Wales, who just didn't use social media. It wasn't part of his armory of how to help himself, but he did, and he went out, and just because he was so honest and just so real, it really worked for him. I think he sold out of everything he did, in something like 4 days, and so the power of that sort of ability to communicate coming from that real personal story, I think, has always been something that I've really gravitated to. They're probably not the most financially rewarding. They're probably not the biggest stories, but they're the ones that I sort of feel the most proud of, I think.
I think all of the projects that you just mentioned have one thing in common, and it's unity of people, which is one of the things that, especially nowadays, is quite a hard thing to see in some cases. Society, with all of the access to information and everything, gets more and more divided. So even the smallest things, like the business owner, as you mentioned, in Wales, selling everything out within a couple of days, like you have that trust back in society, and it's like, we still care for each other. Humans are still here, which I think is absolutely fantastic, and I really applaud for work like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think and it's always the thing that it makes me emotional. It makes me sort of, as you say, it makes you really sort of happy that that's who we are, as people, really, as a sort of, as society generally, is that, we are so connected in that way. And that, even with screens and laptops and AI and everything else that's thrown in the mix, that that actually, our essence really is to ideally help and be connected and be together. So I think, and when it comes to telling brand stories, which is part of what I do, or part of what I need to listen to when I work with new brands, it really is that sort of, what is the story, what is the connection, what is the essence, really, of what we're trying to say, and that always comes back to that similar thing.
I even got goosebumps just thinking about it.
Oh yeah, so did I, actually. Yeah, it also actually makes me feel quite emotional. I usually, when I see things like that, I always start to. It's the one time my wife always laughs, because I always start getting a bit teary.
My partner always laughs at me that I literally can see. To me, the ones that get me the most is normally like soldiers coming back from war to surprise their families.
Oh, okay.
Like anything on that line, like any random videos that has a tiny bit of society and the warmth. I'm just sitting on a sofa full in tears, and my partner always like, how on earth? Like, this is an advert for a shampoo. Like, why are you crying?
Yeah,
but
great.
it's a very good advert.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it, that?
But I think that's the good advertisement as well, because it touches not only on your logical side, as like, oh, I might need a shampoo, but it touches you inside as well, and touches on all of the sides of your brain and inside of your soul and emotions.
Yeah, it's tricky though, isn't it? Yeah, correct. I think completely right. I think that although unless it's authentic, it can have the opposite effect. So I think that the authenticity is always really, it's actually quite hard to achieve, I think, especially when you're, say, making an advert for a shampoo, right? Because shampoo has nothing to do with soldiers coming back from war. And actually, if you could put those two things together, unless you do it really well, and that's when a really good director or creative or really good cinematographer come into the mix, because that's when they really shine, because they can get that performance, they can make that thing feel really real, and if that happens, then I think then you connect. But obviously we've seen lots of examples of when it doesn't, and it's really cheesy, and it's just really like, sickening. It can really go the other way, quite quickly.
I think nowadays, like, advertisement industry is absolutely fascinating to me in general, with all of the human psychology is changing anyway, and now you have to adapt the whole business industry. How do you work that in? And as you said, how do you make a very cool ad and inspiring ad rather than one that you thought was going to be inspiring, and then next thing you know, you're about to be cancelled?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Pepsi did that, didn't they, with the around the with the riots and using that in their adverts. That was one of those big sort of moments of, oh, you really got that wrong. You really didn't. You tried to connect in that way, but it just turned on you. I wonder what point in that process does someone go, this isn't a good idea. this isn't going to work, but
to me, the most memorable one recently was Balenciaga, where they thought to involve terrible crime against children and children in the same advert. And my question was, is a $1 billion brand, that advert had to go through, I probably would guess 100 or more people. How that many people thought, I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. This sounds like a great idea. Let's see how many people we can trigger today.
Yeah, I mean, that says something quite interesting, I think, about how many iterations or how they test those adverts, right? And how, I worked with a CX agency, a sort of research agency not that long ago. And it was very new to me, actually, about in the music industry. And since then, when I've worked in various bits, it's usually quite, it's usually about my reaction or the team's reaction based on their experience, based on the fact they know what they're talking about, based on their own creativity. Actually, with this agency, it was really a step before almost. You even start to have the creative conversations because you need to understand the market, you need to understand the audience, you need to understand what you're selling. And actually that can really conjure up quite a lot of really quite brutal, to use your word, conversations with the brand about who they are, And I think, to use your Balenciaga example, that to have had those conversations early on probably would have meant that you wouldn't have got in that situation in the first place. But to also have them throughout and to go outside of the bubble, which I imagine Balenciaga is, like any other brand, and talk to someone who isn't in that bubble and say, what do you think? I think is really important, and brands just don't do it. People just, whether it's too costly or they don't like what they want to hear or what they're going to hear, or they just think they know what's right, and actually it's funny when it's not, it must be difficult when they realize quite quickly that what they've done is completely blind, and that they probably could have listened a bit better.
No, completely agree with that. But talking about things listening, I know that you're very involved with Carver Music, a record label that promotes Welsh language children music.
Well, so I moved to Wales when I sold when we left the marketing group and sold my company. I bought a house in Wales and in the mountains, and it was a real different place to live than London, as I'm sure you can imagine. But it was my wife's Welsh and my children. My children are Welsh, and and there's a real sort of the language is amazing. I think it's specifically made for English speaking people not to understand it. I think it's very difficult. I found it very difficult to learn, and still am finding it very difficult to learn. But my son seems to have picked it up quite well. But I kept in touch with a colleague of mine, David from Universal. He was the head of finance for the group, a Welsh chap. And we always talked about the thing in the music industry that we didn't focus on, because we were always focusing on what was cool, was probably the under sevens market, like the under 10s, under sevens, because after that you start to get into pop music, you're starting to get into, from One Direction to K-pop to whatever, Taylor Swift, whatever's next. Right, but before then, it's nursery rhymes and it's children's music, and there was never, for whatever reason, there was never really any focus on it because it's a huge market. It's vast, and the difference between listening to an album when over the age of 12 is that you listen to it a few times. You might listen to it 20 times. You might listen to it 100 times, but children listen to songs probably 1 million times. The amount of times you've heard Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or any of those, I don't know what the equivalent would be
Baby
for you,
Shark.
or Baby Shark. And Baby Shark actually was a really good example of something just of that clicking, that idea of, wow, that no pop hit is ever going to be as big as that track, right? Because it can never be, and it's not cool. but it's huge. So we thought, actually, if we were going to do something in the music business, what would it be? And that felt like a good idea. And it started with this Carrie Canny, which is love singing in Welsh, and it's kids singing along with nursery rhymes, but in the Welsh language. And to date, I think it's had 10 million streams. We haven't had it that long, and there's animated versions of it on YouTube, and they get watched. And they actually the population of Wales is 3 million, right? And that's including adults. So the amount of people listening to it is growing, So they can't all speak Welsh. So I don't know what the attraction is, but it seems to be doing its own thing, which is great. It's a really interesting sort of comment, actually, one on how the music business has changed, but also how people listen to music and how that sort of interaction with music, the best thing that happened was that my son has just started in the new school. The head teacher, we took him around, and the head teacher said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I sort of always have a bit of, I'll do all sorts of things, and I do this and that. Anyway, my wife said, "Oh, he has Carrie music. We do, he does karaoke." And she was starstruck. She was like, she had that moment. Oh my, wow, wow, and I was like, it's an animated thing, So, and I was like, yeah, I suppose that, yeah, we do that, yeah, because they use that in their lessons to teach Welsh. So, and they use it every day, and it was a really great moment of actually achieving something, that connects in a real way, and it doesn't, sadly, streaming doesn't make any money, but it doesn't need to, because it does what it does a happy thing.
I think the reason why Baby Shark came into my mind, I googled not long ago the most played song, and it's still #1 streamed song on YouTube with 14 billion views.
Wow.
Which is like, and then I don't have kids myself, but I meet with my friends who have kids, and I understand why, because some of my friends literally said, if I hear Baby Shark one more time, I think I'm going to have a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
And the same goes with Let It Go from Frozen.
Yes,
has two songs that always comes up.
I'm very aware
in all
of those songs, yeah.
From parents.
Yeah, and I even you mentioning Baby Shark, as soon as you do, then it just goes off in your head, and you probably won't be able to get it out for another couple of days.
I have Enrique Iglesias. Now I have Baby Shark.
Great. Well, I'm sorry I've left you with that, and it's not Enrique, because he's had some great songs,
Yeah, I was a huge fan of Enrique when I was growing up.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I can tell you he's a lovely person.
Oh, that's good to know. That always makes me feel better for listening to someone's music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We touched a little bit on this, but talking about trends in entertainment and advertising, what significant trends have you observed in the advertising and entertainment that's coming now or has been over the last couple of years?
Maybe this is partly to do with my trajectory in terms of my career, but I think, the idea of things being a lot more internationally focused, a lot more global, a lot, that sort of mix of everything from ethnicities to stylings to languages, that understanding of, especially I think with brands, that understanding of that sort of integration of different ideas and from different viewpoints. So I think that's interesting. I mean, inevitably, with that sort of mindset, you might think that everything becomes compromised. It becomes, again, that sort of that bland, mix of everything. But actually, I think there's a lot more focus on brands being probably regionally focused, but internationally based. So I think that's interesting, understanding domestic markets and understanding that they have their own requirements, their own needs, their own nuances. And also, as we've sort of touched upon, the idea that you can make mistakes by putting that one size fits all across a global market, across a brand globally. So I think there's a real need to understand domestic needs. But I think, I would say that's quite interesting and actually lends itself to a much more exciting creative world, because you're pulling from lots of different sources of inspiration, I think in terms of, it happened a while ago, but that idea of making a big ad and that going and as your campaign for a year, that's gone. Now it's about making lots of small pieces of content that really connect, whether it be on social media or whether it be on TV. It's about sort of those experiences. And I think that word experience is really important, because I think it really is about how consumers interact. We talked about it a lot, I think, in terms of, what is my emotional connection? What is my connection to this product or brand or experience? And I think post-lockdown, it is again about experiences, for me anyway. I think it's really about sort of going out and connecting with various things personally in a way that me, my family, and that we can do emotionally and physically and everything else. Because I think when you have that taken away from you, you realize how much you've lost. Yeah, I think there's a lot more opportunity now for making really diverse content, really diverse sort of conversations with different types of people. And I think that's really exciting. It means there's lots more of it. There should be an upsurge in how much people are doing, but also, what they're doing should be more quality orientated. It's not easy. it's easy to make something that's just generic, that you think is going to work, but it's not going to work. You have to make something really pointed, really, I keep using that word connected, but it really has to connect. And that's not an easy thing to do.
And how do you feel that all of the platforms like TikTok and Instagram really pushing that short form content, and with all of the research coming back that, people have only 10 seconds of focus spam? How do you think that's going to affect advertisement industry in general, and how they could tailor their advertisement to fit this need?
I don't want to make sort of big sweeping statements, but I sort of feel like the idea of advertising, the idea of selling a product in the old school way is sort of dead. It's a bit like it, nobody enjoys watching an advert. I don't think, maybe in the 80s when they had to, there was maybe a sort of, or 90s, there was a sort of feeling that, that was a great ad. I don't feel like I've seen a great ad for 20 years. So I sort of, I can't remember one. And so I think it really isn't about making advertising anymore. It's about sort of connecting with people, what people want. And that, I always talked about, and hopefully it's coming to fruition, the idea that, trying to make content that people want to watch, and then that would maybe be brought to you by a brand. So the example I would normally go to is make a film about the surf scene in New York, because I didn't realize there's a surf scene in New York. I didn't even because I'm, culturally literate, but I didn't realize that was a thing. And I think that's really interesting. And I sort of thought, well, you could make a documentary about that, really short form, really punchy, just really good photography, done by a soundtracked by a really cool band. And at the end of it, right at the end of it, no product all the way through it, but right at the end of it, it says to you, brought to you by Jack Daniels, or brought to you by, something. And I think to me that would fulfill two needs. One, it's something I want to watch, or it's something someone like me might want to watch. But also that, I feel good about the brand because they're not trying to trick me by sort of someone halfway through this great bit of content drinking, whatever brand it is that they're trying to sell me, which is always is always a sort of sigh of, really, I'd sort of, I just think it's unnecessary, it's pointless, and it doesn't work. So I think that actually, it builds respect, by giving people what they want, making great content, which is, there's lots of ideas out there that need to be made, and really heightening the brand's sort of relationship with the audience. I think that for me is how the trend should be going. Whether it is or not, I will see.
I think it's already going the right direction. I was actually having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with one of my friends in marketing, and we were talking about advertisement that we used to see when we were growing up. And one that came to our mind, there was I can't remember the exact, to be honest, I can remember the brand, but I'm not going to say it on here. The one that advertised cigarettes.
Right.
And that's probably the most memorable ad of like very expressive people, Texas Rangers on horses with cigarettes in their hands.
I know which one you mean.
Yeah. I saw that ad when I was like 5, probably.
Yeah.
And it's still in my head that many years later. And I was like, I'm pretty sure we're going the right direction if you're making ads that doesn't influence 5-year-olds to smoke.
Absolutely, yeah, they did a great job of that, didn't they? But it was also I think the film industry did a good job of that as well, because if you were cool as well as if you were bad, and if you were beautiful to an extent for a period, you smoked, right? So it was sort of it was a sort of cool thing to do. And also the music industry didn't help either. But yeah, I think you're right. And also in that ad, and I know which one you're talking about, the print campaign that went along with it was always amazing as well. And those people they were just like otherworldly beings, they were just fantastic. Yeah. And so, and often they weren't smoking, it was just a picture of them looking gorgeous or sort of thoughtful or whatever. But it really was well done. You're almost encapsulating what it would be to have a dream, like almost to dream of an aspirational situation and sort of what would that look like and the best way it could look. I sort of, it does hark back to a time when it was a real craft, actually, when it was a real sort of, there's some probably brilliant creative people working in it and delivering amazing work, but, and I'm sure there are now. I'm sure there are some fantastical people, and work with some of them, and I think that's the thing is that, your question, I suppose, was about Instagram and TikTok, and actually you do see some really interesting concepts on there because it is a little bit more free, and I think that sort of freedom is really important. That sort of maybe that actually, there's lots of negativity about those platforms, but actually it does create a freedom. It also creates lots of negative freedoms, but it does create a freedom for creativity.
One topic that I still want to touch on, and you nicely brought that up as well, that you worked with some of the very, very amazing people. Have you had any mentors who influence your career, and how do you approach mentoring others yourself?
I have had some amazing mentors, and I mentioned Jeremy. I thought was pretty inspirational. When I worked at Universal, I think that at the time she gave me a bit of a hard time, but she was definitely the best boss I'd ever had. It was a lady called Karen Simmons, and she was brilliant at saying, because I was in a position where we had quite a lot of money to spend, and it would have been easy to spend it with the same people. But she said, who were brilliant, you get it right once, let's do it again. But she said, you'll be fired if you keep using the same people. It's not your job. Your job is to find new talent, new creative, new be different and be better. Which I thought was really bold, because as I said, it's easier to go to the safe option. And also that she had a real sort of integrity when it came to dealing with people. She was very straight up, and she was very straightforward, to the point where it could appear rude, but actually it wasn't rude. It was just that it was maybe that you just didn't want to hear it, right? So there was a way of sort of communicating which I felt really was very honest, and also that she was one of the first sustainably minded people that I'd ever met. She rode her bike everywhere. She got the train when she could. She didn't drive, and she got to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she left at 6, and you couldn't contact her outside of that, right? She ran, at one point she ran the whole label. The only time that I think she ever did pick up the phone was when Snoop Dogg had come to the UK and got arrested because he had weed on him, and she had to go and get him out of jail. And so that was an emergency that she was going to pick the phone up for. But I've found that really, because it was a business, is that you're working all the time, as many hours as, sending an email at 6 in the morning and one at 11 o'clock at night, when then you're perceived as working really hard. When actually, and there might be a requirement for that. I know when I run my own business, sometimes there is, but actually that I felt that sort of mindset was really just organized. She was just really well organized, and she's probably one of the busiest people I've ever met, but she just had really great time management. So I found her very inspirational. She was a great mentor. The guy who now runs Universal, David Joseph, I think for different reasons, he was a very inspirational person. And since then, obviously I had my own business. I worked for myself. And I think it's important to say, when you are a business owner, I always think that there's a propensity, or there's the opportunity to go a little bit mad, because you're only answering to yourself. So you actually, and you've got to be, and it's really difficult to be self-aware in that situation. I think we've all seen The Office. It's that sort of, you almost start to become that sort of slightly bizarre character if you let yourself, and so, especially when you're successful, because it propels that myth that you're doing the right thing and that your decision making is correct and everything else. I think it's really difficult to be able to see yourself from an external perspective. And so, since leaving, doing that, having that business myself, and now I consult to various different brands, I'm always sort of interested in how people behave, because I think it's really, as bosses and as try and put yourself in the position of someone who is at the bottom of the hierarchy. How does it look to them? How are they treated? Because I think that that's a very good indication of how good you are as a manager or boss or leader.
Obviously, you had such inspiration in your career. When it comes to you now managing creative teams on different campaigns that sometimes getting billions of views, what strategies do you personally use to inspire those people and lead them?
Well, I think, initially it's about finding great people, and there's an art to that, I think. I think there's a real need for respect, mutual respect. If you're having to tell someone what to do, it's usually either because you've not prepared properly, or because they don't understand it correctly, or there's a reason for it. So I think the best situation is when you can let people be good at what they're really good at, and then try and communicate between people and let them communicate with each other in a way that means that they can do that really effectively. So it sounds a bit hands off. It sounds a little bit like to manage correctly, don't manage. But it's not. Every now and again, you've got to step in, and sometimes there's a reason for hierarchy, and that you've got to take responsibility. I think that's really important. But also that, I think as a creative person as well, it's difficult. Sometimes you've got a great idea and you really want everybody to be on board with it. It might not be right. Your idea might not be the best. It might be that actually I've found working with teams is that you might have the inkling of a good idea, but it gets really good when it's run through the mill of a team, when they've all got some stake in it and everybody feels like they can add something. That needs management, not all ideas are great. It's about being able to have a sort of honest conversation about it with people that respect each other.
I think one thing that I find really interesting, what you just said, that a lot of managers, especially very young and new managers, when they enter into a role, they are really scared to admit that they don't know all the answers, and their idea might not be the best, and they might make mistakes. And I've seen it over and over again, where I actually have seen quite a few managers cry in their career, where it's like, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to say it. And it's like, just have an open conversation, and like everything will be all right. We're all humans. Like, the fact that you're a manager doesn't mean you're a god.
No, exactly. And that it's funny actually, because Karen, the person I mentioned that was at Universal, the mentor and my boss, I remember her saying to me, when you hire someone better than you. And I remember thinking at the time, because I was an arrogant man of 30 or whatever, that I remember thinking, why would I do that? Then they'll come in and take my job. But actually, as I've become more experienced and probably learned my lessons, I sort of get it. You sort of think, well, of course, that inevitably it will have a positive effect on the business. It will have a positive effect on you, because you won't have to step in and take over things and take that responsibility. Also, if you have if you manage your own ego well enough, then you don't need to do those things anyway. You should be able to sort of, celebrate the fact that other people are fantastic, at what they are and what they can achieve. So I think, that lesson I've learned to understand with time. I
think ego is normally the biggest enemy in majority of people's decisions and management as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a curse, isn't it, throughout any business, actually. It can cause such ugliness,
But at the same time, if you don't have any ego, ambition, you're just going to probably blend with the mass and not going to stand out. And especially when you're running a business, you still have to have that eagerness in yourself to believe in yourself more than anyone else does. Otherwise, no one's going to buy from you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're right. And when you're saying that, I probably would just word it differently. It's about belief, isn't it? It's about confidence without arrogance. It's about sort of balance. It's about being able to sort of believe in what you're doing and believe in yourself to be able to achieve it in a way that doesn't push anybody else over or hurt their feelings, or because why do you need to do that? I think that energy is really hard to balance. I'm sure I've made huge mistakes in the past of not being able to, but I think it's a very important art to master.
I'm already keeping you here for over 1 hour.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Talking about your future and your future plans, so what are your goals, both professionally and personally? What's next for Ross?
Well, I'm working with a company at the moment, and they're a global production house called NAF Plus, and they are so we're working with them. I was really attracted by them because they are global, and I think that most production houses have their offices in maybe 2 or 3 different countries, but they don't have that international reach. So I was really interested by that. They're doing some work in the Middle East, which has its there's a whole different conversation around that. But I think they're also working with people like Neom on that project, which I was really sort of interested by, for very careful to want to sort of run towards because of all the things we all know. But I think that the Middle East is a really interesting place at the moment in terms of the way that society is changing, the way that especially in Saudi Arabia, that that I think it's 70% of the population are under 45. So there's a real change of the mindset there, and the way that they're really focused on sustainability and everything else. So interested in that, and working out how that communicates and how that settles and how that visualizes itself. I think that, my role at the moment, though, is really sort of starting to build partnerships between different businesses. I think when I started Nice and Polite, it felt competitive. It felt like everybody was there in their own silo competing against everybody else, right? And I sort of realized once I'd left that actually, if I'd have focused more on building friendships and building partnerships and understanding other people's approaches and joining forces on things, that would have probably created even more success. And I think that's been my sort of rule of thumb really for the last couple of years, has been, trying to have conversations with different businesses, different contemporaries, different peers in my industry, but also outside of it, to say, how can we help each other? So I think that's where I'm at the moment. And that's, I think, what the future looks like.
What parting advice would you give to our listeners who are on the journey of chasing their dreams similarly to yourself and building successful careers, whether in entertainment industry, in music, advertisement, or just in general?
Well, I'd probably go back to my son's poster and just say it's cool to be kind. I think that, if there's a sort of, your approach is everything. And I think that, as we talked about at length, really, we're all people and we all want to be successful and we all want to grow. And I think that, there's a way of doing that, and so I'd say, yeah, it's cool to be kind.
Love that. And how can our listeners connect with you or follow you, your work? Do you have any upcoming projects or initiatives you would like to share?
Well, I've got a couple of films in development, so hopefully they'll come to some fruition. I think you can check me out on at Mr. Anderson Limited on Instagram and follow the sort of progress that way. And my website, which is mr-anderson.co.uk.
Perfect. I'll add all of that in the description box below. Do you want to share your LinkedIn at all, or that's not where you communicate with people?
It is. It's Mr. Ross Anderson. Yeah, it's LinkedIn. It's yeah, please do. Yeah, and happy to connect with anybody who enjoyed this conversation and wants to work together in some capacity or another in the future. Happy to chat. Always up for a conversation.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Ross, for being here with us today. I absolutely enjoy our conversation. I feel like I could have spoken for another 2 hours probably, but I'm weary of our listeners and your time. So maybe I'll bring you sometime next year, maybe, or the end of this year.
Oh, I'd love that.
Know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, definitely keep in touch, Vicky, and thanks so much for having me.